I'm going to need to stick with the fundamentals of faith here today because I have a really complicated relationship with this passage in the gospel and passages like it about faith, and that complication is rooted deep in my childhood. Some of you may understand more deeply than others, and the rest of you, I'm going to invite you to please humor me when I confess to you that this Jesus in this passage and passages like it, the Jesus of, if you just had just a teeny bit of faith, you'd be able to do these spectacular things. You would move this mountain, you would uproot this mulberry tree, you would exorcise this demon, etc. The problem for me is that this Jesus and the sound of his words remain in my imagination utterly and eternally confounded with the voice of Yoda. The part in The Empire Strikes Back. And I don't mean to be flip here, and I don't mean to be heretical, although the latter is probably unavoidable. But I'm serious when I say that this matter, this notion of believing hard enough, of believing strong enough, of demonstrating to myself that I have enough faith, it was really important to me, and really important in that Star Wars-y kind of way to a decent chunk of a whole generation of American kids whose spiritual lives were a mashup of Star Wars and the New Testament. I loved Jesus as a child, and I wanted to be a disciple of Jesus in elementary school. And I hated the Empire, and I wanted the Force to be strong with me. And I figured that I probably looked a lot like one of Jesus' actual disciples when I would sit for hours on end in the backyard, trying with all my little heart and mind and my outstretched hand to make the rocks lift up out of my mother's flower bed. Anybody? Yeah, thanks. And let me tell you, I believed it, and I waited, and I believed it, and I kept waiting. And so when I heard in church that Jesus said that if I had enough faith I could move mountains, I believed that too, really literally. And when I hear the words of Jesus even today, telling his disciples what it would look like if only they had just enough faith, I still totally imagine Luke Skywalker's X-Wing starfighter sinking into a swamp because he failed to use the Force. But Yoda, his master, succeeds with ease. And Luke exclaims, "I don't believe it." And Yoda says in his grave, Muppety voice, "That is why you fail." Faith is not meant to set us up for a life of failure. That's not what Jesus is talking about here. But boy, we lay ourselves a trap, don't we? Sometimes in the way that we interpret both these, our most sacred stories, and our modern myths. We lay a trap. An ego-tripping self-improvement notion that if you believe it, you can achieve it. And now even as a grown-up, I think fairly well beyond magical thinking, I'm hoping, well beyond magical thinking, that I can still actually convince myself that if I believe harder, if I work harder, if I try harder, I can doubt less and have more faith. And the payoff will be a connection between my willpower and the spectacularly miraculous. It is really easy to interpret the gospel passages about faith, the ones like today's passage. It's easy to interpret them that way too. That if only we have just enough confidence, if we believe that it's possible in God, that it will come to pass. The only thing is it doesn't come to pass, does it? The mulberry tree business doesn't come to pass in the Gospels. There is never actually an occasion where Jesus casually re-landscapes the Palestinian hillside, with the power of God that is present in him. So I'm not sure that he's actually talking seriously here, but he's still talking spectacularly. And so what is this faith, this tiny mustard seed faith that he's talking about? He's hanging around with people who don't have much faith. The people he chooses to spend his time with, they're pretty low on faith. And the people that he commends for having faith, they aren't people who do anything spectacular. Think about like the centurion with the son and the hemorrhaging woman. They don't do anything spectacular. They actually plead for something that they know they need that's beyond their power. So what is this faith like a mustard seed that Jesus is talking about? Okay, so it's tiny, really tiny. Mustard seeds are like less than 1/20 of an inch. They're really tiny, and they grow into spectacularly large plants, meters tall. They happen to be a noxious weed, an amazing one if what you're aiming for are amber waves of grain. But the thing about a seed, tiny or large, the thing about a seed is that wherever it's planted, even if that's in your own heart, you can't make a seed increase, can you? I mean, I think it's fair to say that you can neglect it. I think it's fair to say that you can tend it. But you can't make a seed grow. But faith is like a seed in that it will grow. That's what it's meant to do. That's what seeds are for. And it's planted in us, and it will grow, but not because we try. I know this from experience. When I heard a call to ministry in my life years back, and I up and went to seminary with one foot still in each door of the religious humanism of my adulthood and stepping back into the Christianity of my childhood, I felt like I needed to increase my faith. I felt like I needed to choose a tradition. And I looked toward Christianity wanting to find a really good reason to step through the door back into the Christian church. And it came down to belief. I wanted a good reason to believe. And I prayed. I believe, Lord, help my unbelief. I wrestled and I read and I wrote and I prayed some more and I waited. Just like the 7-year-old waiting, watching the rocks. But it turns out nothing ever happened. I never got more belief. Because it turns out that belief isn't actually faith. Faith is that seed. It's the desire to believe that's been planted in us. And so I just had to do something. I just had to uproot myself, and I had to step with both feet through the door back into the Christian church. And I noticed that doing that, the seed started to grow. Not because I wished for the seed to grow, but because I did something, and then I paid attention. Friends, I don't think that we can have faith better. I don't think that we can have faith stronger than we already have. And yet, faith takes root in us, roots more deep than a mulberry tree in the desert. And faith grows up into something of its own accord, something so alive, something so strong that whole flocks of lovely and true beliefs can come and nest in that faith like birds. And nothing can tear it out. Faith isn't something that you can increase, and it's not something you can work harder at. Faith isn't the labor of my mind and my heart. Faith is when my mind and my heart finally come to rest. And so to be of little faith isn't to fail, like Yoda says. To be of little faith is to need to rest in God. And faith isn't a show of our own power. It's a recognition that we will always and ever need a power beyond ourselves. And to not even have as much faith as a tiny mustard seed, almost invisible to the eye, that's not to fail Jesus. That's not to fall out with Jesus. It's to be exactly like all those other people he chose to spend his time with. But if we look how he spends his time, and what he asks the members of his club of O ye of little faith to do while they're hanging out with him, we see that faith is not idle. It might be the rest of our heart and our mind, but the desire that is faith leads our hands to do work. I can't help but laugh thinking about my 7-year-old self sitting there in the garden, wanting so very much for those garden rocks to move. But the thing is what I actually wanted was for my will to be done. Because if I wanted that garden rock to move, I would have got up and I would have used my small but strong 7-year-old hands and I would have moved the rock. But that's not the thing that I desired. I desired my own will to be done spectacularly. If I'm convinced that what God desires is the miraculous, even if it's to rip a mulberry tree up out of the hillside and to relocate it to the shallows of the sea, I will probably get up and get a shovel and dig, and I will drag, and I will drop it into the salt water. All the while with my heart and my mind at rest. Maybe that's faith. Maybe that's how it all comes to pass. One of our dancing saints, Sadi, he's in the orange. He has the tiger, who's not his pet. The tiger is a character in a story about what faith looks like. There's a man who's out in the wilderness, and he comes across a lame fox. And it looks like it's been lame for a long time, and yet it's alive, and he can't figure out how is this happening. And so he waits, and he watches. He sits next to the fox hidden in the desert, and he notices that a tiger comes every morning and every night. A tiger bringing fresh kill of meat, feeds the lame fox, and then disappears into the wilderness. And it happens day after day after day. And the man says to himself, surely, if I can muster up faith that God will provide for me as God has provided for this fox, all my needs will be met. And so this man sits himself down in the desert, kind of like 7-year-old Kerri in 1981, sits down and waits and wills God to meet his needs through sheer miraculous power. And he waits for 3 days, morning and night, and morning and night, and morning and night, and finally he's really, really hungry. In one version of the story, he just gets up and leaves the desert. In another version of the story, an angelic messenger comes and says to him, "Silly man, faith will never do the thing that you can do yourself." And so I think that faith is the mustard seed and the uprooting of the mulberry tree. Faith is the trust-filled rest and the desire-filled action. We know that we cannot accomplish it all, and yet we do what we can. And so if, friends, you come here sometimes feeling like you may be having a crisis of faith, if you feel like a disciple and you're saying, God, could you just increase my faith? Know this. The faith you have is enough. Even if it's not as big as a mustard seed, it is enough. If you worry that nothing spectacular is happening from your prayer or your effort, don't fret. The disciples worried about the same thing. If you can't obey the prophet Habakkuk or the psalmist and stop worrying about evildoers, if you can't stop crying out to God, why am I waiting so long for justice to happen in your world? Give your heart and your mind a rest. If you come to the table wondering, is this thing that I'm doing magical thinking? Give your heart and your mind a moment's rest. Know that the seed of faith is planted in you, and just reach out your hands to do the work, which there is just to receive the bread and receive the wine. The faith that you have doesn't need to be spectacular. You cannot fail to have faith. The faith you have is more than enough, so let it become what you live.